Ridley Scott's penchant for scale is in everything he's most famous for. Sprawling, Douglas Trumbulled-up vistas of a futuristic Los Angeles, a massive derelict craft in the middle of uncharted space, and, of course, the battlefield. The Oscar-nominated director has, through his entire career, deployed some very specific tactics. It's a campaign that's worth studying, one that actually starts with his first film and just two men with a grudge in The Duelists. From a hyper-focus on process to codes of honor and at least one tricky bit of filmmaking each time out, here is how Ridley Scott goes to battle. The formula for Ridley Scott's most epic battle sequences, I would argue, began in Strasbourg, 1800. Two Napoleonic officers, one who is clearly from the Bronx, are engaged in a years-long battle of wills, beginning with an honor besmirched and a challenge reluctantly accepted. In part, the movie is about the absurdity of the rules of the day, which we'll get to in a second, but where the rules are concerned, the movie lays them out explicitly. How the duels work, what the consequences are of their actions or non-actions are all clear as day. And it's a good thing too, because the why of their fighting is purposely vague, absurd, and secondary. It's a very small story, but a type of story that makes it clear why Ridley Scott is so good at the big stuff. As a quick tangent, if there was ever an incredible apples-to-apples comparison of the difference in filmmakers' approach, we stumbled onto one right here on Cinefix. Lucky enough to get both Ridley Scott and Denis Villeneuve for My Best Shots, we asked them both to choose their favorite moments from their respective Blade Runners. Ridley Scott chose the extravagant and FX-heavy opening shot. Denis Villeneuve chose a close-up of Ryan Gosling's hand. This is, of course, not to say that one is better than the other, or there's a right or wrong way to go about making a movie about androids. It is to highlight the fact that two very good filmmakers can handle more or less the same subject matter in wildly different ways, and further illustrates the type of thing Ridley Scott is focused on in his work. For Ridley Scott, the first priority is the nuts and bolts. To begin with, Ridley's setups are meticulous. The logistics of the battle we're about to witness are always very clearly defined. The opposing sides, their viewpoints, the tactics, even opening narration or title cards for added context, which, to be fair, is a staple of nearly all of his movies, actually. But for every detail that is set up in the calm before the storm, there's a corresponding payoff. The opening siege in Robin Hood is filled with this business, and not in a perfunctory way. It establishes a dynamic between Robin and his soon-to-be merry men in the roles they're assigned in the systematic attack on a French castle. Kingdom of Heaven does the same thing with its white rocks in the lead-up to the final battle in Jerusalem, with the whole scene built around their placement. Again, it's a scene that both sets up the tactics of a battle and highlights the ingenuity of a character. On a smaller scale, The Last Duel opens on a montage of the combatants of the titular duel suiting up. Close-ups of armor being tightened, weapons being selected, and a lady being dressed. Everything that the movie will deal with for the next 2.5 hours. In that sense, it's not a small scale at all. The movie has its share of scale, but the duel itself, being between two men with the fate of a third person hanging in the balance, the opening is dedicated to all three of them preparing. It'll be another 2 hours before we see the battle in full, and by the time we get there, it more than lives up to its top billing. But for a high watermark of Ridley Scott's battle prep, take the opening battle between the Roman legions and the Germanic tribe in Gladiator. Look at the screen time spent on archers preparing, fires lit for their arrows, catapults set and loaded with oil, troops positioned in orderly lines. This does two pretty incredible things for the sequence. First, there's the obvious setup and payoff of seeing how the preparations turn into the executions. The order is given by a commander, the big oily ball is loaded into a catapult, the weapon is cranked into the firing position so that later when we see it fired, we also see the resulting impact on the battle, which is, side note, an actual forest being burned. But Ridley and his team were, funny enough, doing the Forest Service in England a favor though, as the ground was too sandy to support the trees and the area was scheduled to be cleared anyway. The second thing that I believe is the most vital to the success of this sequence is that it juxtaposes the order and precision of the Roman army against the shield-thumping, violent disorder of the Germanic tribe. Just a few cutaways is all it takes to give the impression that these warriors, passionate and brave though they may be, don't stand a chance against the Roman forces. and set up an entire movie's worth of context for how Rome goes about its business. This empire is a machine, but beating in its heart for this particular moment is our hero Maximus saying things like this.
People should know when they're conquered.
Would you, Quintus? Would I?
There's a respect for his opponents, an understanding and empathy that gives a warm shape to the protagonist. He, no matter what confronts him for the rest of this film, will take it on with strength and honor, which would be a great little motto if they were to say it out loud a few times, because it also transitions perfectly into the next part of Ridley Scott's battle plan.
Strength and honor.
Strength and honor.
Strength and honor.
Describe honor.
Honor?
Honor.
Honor is indescribable.
This presence of honor, of a warrior's code of sorts, is at the dead center of Ridley Scott's work, particularly in connection with the tactics men can and cannot employ. The other aspect of all this battle prep we've discussed is setting up the rules of the world. Take Black Hawk Down, which is, in this sense, a film about an evolving and increasingly desperate set of tactics based on one simple rule, that they leave no man behind. We mentioned the rules at play in his first film, The Duelists, and to get back to that, the rules all have to do with the gentleman's honor.
You have insulted me, and I demand an apology.
This is too ridiculous.
Keith Carradine's character, Dubert, is more than fully aware of the absurdity at play here. Harvey Keitel's Ferreau is a rash and angry brute who just kinda decided to be offended when Dubert is sent to collect him for a superior officer. Ferreau throws down the challenge, and because Dubert is aware of the rules and the honor at stake, has no choice but to accept, kicking off a decade and a half of trying to kill each other whenever their paths cross until neither can remember why. Not that there was even a good reason to begin with, simply because, as his friend puts it,
like it or not, you are a man of reputation.
But while the rules establish honor as a core principle of battle, it's not a completely separate issue. This aspect of his epics works best when layered on top of the logistics. We've already talked about Gladiator's expert deployment of honor, but it's taken to a new place in the moments after the battle, when we see the way soldiers revere Maximus versus the way they feel about Commodus. It's honor that makes the difference. Also, Robin Hood finds a quiet moment after the battle to reflect with a speech about the brutality of the Crusades. Napoleon is all about the pride and arrogance of its main character, but we're going back to The Last Duel for the best example of honor's role in his work. After the incredible cold open on the preparation for the brutal duel to come, we spend the rest of the movie getting to find out what brought them there from 3 different perspectives. How did it come to this? There's tragedy at the center of the story with the rape of Jodie Comer's Marguerite at the hands of Adam Driver's Legree, which, of course, is a 14th century attack on Marguerite's husband, Matt Damon's Jean de Carouche, whose honor is clearly the real victim here. The Rashomon treatment of a medieval grudge match turns into a fascinating look at the repercussions of honor. Whereas other films in his career have used honor as a virtue, The Last Duel, like The Duelists way back at the beginning of his feature film career, is about the dangerous side of honor. The mud and gore and violence, not to mention the lies, misinterpretation, and arrogance, are all a direct result of an absurd sense of honor, which, layered on top of the cold, determined way the 3 main characters prepare for the duel, gives the movie a sense of inevitability. That none of this is up to any of them because they're so beholden to these rules. The only way out is through. That the only way to determine who's telling the truth is to fight to the death to see who God thinks is right is truly an antiquated line of logic. However, that he starts the film at the end, then divides the story into 3 versions of the same series of events is itself one giant bit of creative filmmaking. It's a technique that heightens the intrigue around the final duel. Had we not opened on our 3 main characters' stoic preparations for the fight, I'm not sure the movie would have had the same pace, the same drive to the finish that it wound up with. But the important thing to note here is The Last Duel, like the rest of Ridley's most epic battle sequences, employs something a little extra to make its point. Because Ridley Scott has a great eye, something he's told us on more than one occasion, every great battle he's ever filmed takes full advantage of that asset. He's sure to use at least one bit of tricked out filmmaking every time. Gladiator uses some very cool step print to accentuate the chaos of the actual battle after the orderly photography of the preparations. He also got in the habit of using head height camera work to put us in the perspective of battle. Gladiator, Robin Hood, and Kingdom of Heaven all feature low, long lens shots of the movie's heroes with expansive battlefields behind them, which, when you pay for all those specialized background stunt players, you want to make sure you get your money's worth. The Duelists, of course, set this precedent. If it didn't, I suppose I'd have to go back and rewrite all of this. The film edits quick flashes of memory and a handful of strategic shots throughout the film. It's a technique that highlights Duber's anger and frustration at how the entire grudge match began and persists. It's motivation for him after 15 years or so of mindless dueling, and perspective for us after an hour of screen time. It reiterates that Duber is still the protagonist here if we became unsure at all. But there's one particular moment in Scott's filmography that's very worth looking at here, and that's the Battle of Austerlitz in Napoleon. To start with, the logistics and prep that we talked about earlier are actually absent from this sequence in a very interesting way. Eschewing his usual focus on the battle plan, we see that Napoleon is confident, and we know he's a hell of a strategist at this point in the movie, but we only learn about his plans for the battle at the same time as his enemy. It's a savvy subversion of his usual tactics, one that gives us the perilous feeling of going up against Bonaparte. But it's not until those tactics have won the battle that we get this shot. It's a simple, slow-motion push towards Napoleon watching his tactics unfold. And this shot is death. It's the first time in the sequence that we get slow motion, and it opens the door for its use for the remainder of the battle. This one slow-motion shot serves the same function in the scene as cranking a catapult into place in Gladiator, only to see it lob a fiery payload into the trees during the battle. It's cause and effect. We see the slow-motion shot of Napoleon first, then we get slow-motion shots of the carnage his plan is inflicting on his opponents. And that's what I mean when I say this shot is death. Visually, the death and destruction we subsequently see in slow motion is now subconsciously tied to this first push-in on the Emperor. Slow motion is such a ubiquitous tool. It can be used without thought or purpose, but here it's used as a battlefield tactic in a way that's truly creative. The Battle of Austerlitz is a combination of everything Scott loves to do with the battle sequence, but subverted by just a nudge, because while Napoleon is the main character of the film, he is not the hero. The usual tricks and tactics to, say, highlight a noble Roman general who's about to be thrust down a tragically heroic new path in his life would not and should not translate to a self-proclaimed emperor who, by the tally of the end credits, was responsible for over 3 million deaths in his 20-plus years of campaigning. But now, at the end of this lengthy video essay, it's time for your spoiler warning for Ridley Scott's first film from 1977. The Duelists ends with Duber defeating Ferrot, not by killing him, but by invoking the rules of honor. He could have killed him, but did not, and by the rules of combat, Ferrot's life belongs to Duber. This is an injury worse than death for Ferrot, but for the film, it's an incredible thesis. The entire movie is dedicated to the structure of battle. There are rules, and there is honor, and there is true futility for its characters in trying to avoid either of them. By the end of The Duelists, Scott has deployed sound design, flashback to make his point, not to mention one incredibly poetic final shot of Harvey Keitel's Ferrot looking out on a gorgeous vista, the sun peeking out from behind a dark sky, lens flares in the foreground as a symbol of Duber's more noble notions of honor overtaking Ferrot, whether he likes it or not. The Duelists is a simple, small-scale version of everything Scott does in a battle. Ridley Scott, as a technician, is as unimpeachable as filmmakers can get. He's as in control of his craft as the generals, emperors, and soldiers he portrays in his films. The battle sequences in his filmography that are truly memorable succeed on all three of these fronts, while the ones that aren't so iconic are probably missing one or two ingredients. But I think the most interesting thing about it all is how simply the Duelists laid out Ridley's battle plans at the very beginning of his film career.